I do want to clarify that there are two distinct steps that predicting can and often does take place. So does anyone know the two places that the predicting process really kind of happens? You're reading the passage, right? And as you're reading, the predicting may begin as you start to become more and more familiar with their patterns. But you read the passage and then you're going to town on the passage. If it's an argument, you're trying to figure out whether it's good or bad. And if it's bad, why it's bad. If it's not an argument, you're just trying to figure out what must follow from the facts that they gave you. But either way, you're doing some work there, right? And then you read the question. And as soon as you read the question, that may refine your prediction even further. You may already have an answer. Like if the argument is, if the passage is an argument and it's flawed, well, once I'm done reading the passage, I've probably already identified that it's confusing, sufficient for necessary, or whatever, right? And then the question says, which one of the following best describes the flaw in the argument? It's like, well, I'm not surprised at all that you're asking me to describe the flaw because I just identified a flaw. Now, they could ask you a whole host of other things. They could ask you what a necessary assumption is, or they could ask you what would strengthen the argument. I don't necessarily expect them to ask me what the flaw is just because I found a flaw. But I probably don't need to do much more predicting at that point because I've already identified a flaw, maybe two flaws, maybe three flaws, but at least one. And so then as soon as I read which one of the following answers best describes the flaw, I don't need to do any more predicting. So then I just go into the answers. But sometimes, you read an argument, you figure out what's wrong with it, and then you read the question and it says, which one of the following, if true, justifies the conclusion? Well, that's a sufficient assumption question. And I know on sufficient assumption questions, I can predict the answer almost precisely, almost perfectly. So in that case, I'm going to take a little extra effort and say, okay, what exactly do I want to get from the premises to the conclusion? I make that prediction, and then I go into the answer choices. So those two spots, right, after the passage and after the question, is where you should be doing some work. And I think that when people first start doing this, they can fall into the trap of trying to be overly specific in their predictions, right? They're like, oh, the answer is going to be XYZ. And it's like, no, they actually gave you a different answer and you didn't see it because you were so hyper-focused on your particular prediction. What you have to keep in mind is the Goldilocks prediction, which is, you're identifying what's wrong with the argument. You're raising some objections, but usually your objections are specific issues with the gap in reasoning, but there are multiple issues that could arise because of that gap. Let me give you a quick example. People who buy 2 pairs of running shoes every year tend to run more than those who buy 1 or fewer pairs. Fair? Sound good? So, therefore, buying running shoes causes you to run more. What's wrong with this argument? Anyone know? This is the LSAT's. Yeah, this is a correlation versus causation problem. Lily, you're saying it switches cause and effect? Actually, we didn't have a causal premise. The premise was just people who buy 2 pairs of running shoes tend to run more. But we don't know why. All we know is that that's happening. So is the buying of running shoes what makes them run more? Could be. We don't know for sure. But that is what I concluded. And it's very possible that people who want to run more tend to buy these shoes, and people who want to run more tend to run more. So it's like something else causes both of those things to happen, but neither one has a causal effect on each other, right? So I'm going to see that argument. I'm going to say, okay, you're going from correlation to causation. Although correlation provides some evidence for causation, it doesn't prove it. And that's the standard on the LSAT. You have to prove your conclusions. So my objection might be, hey, people who want to run end up doing this. And I have to be open to the possibility that there's something else entirely that could explain why these two things happen together, right? And so, in fact, maybe it's the reverse, right? Maybe people who run more wear out their shoes faster, and that causes them to buy their shoes, right? Like that's certainly a possibility. And so I'm raising objections, but I realize that my objections may not be the specific objection that the LSAT decides to give me in one of the correct answers. So predictions are, maybe the word is too strong. It's more like objections and then loose predictions after I read the question. Always with somewhat of an open mind as to some other possible way that someone might object to that hole in the reasoning.